Honestly, can't even finish my haiku without being interrupted.
Hello folks, as you can see from the title, this is obviously a Kazuha guide. Since he has a lot of intricacies with his abilities and builds, this will be one of my longer videos, but let's jump right in. Kazuha is an Anemo character that was given mid-reception at first, similar to Albedo. He isn't another hypercarry like the previous new 5-star characters. Instead, Kazuha is a great buffer and can do decent damage as a burst support. Lots of characters fit that role, so that's probably why the hype for him isn't as high as the other 5 stars, especially due to his release timing, since a lot of players are going to be saving up for the 5-star Inazuma characters. For those of you that have already pulled for him or are on the fence, then I hope this video will help you out. We will go through his abilities, the perks that make him unique compared to other similar characters, and various builds for our wanted samurai. One thing that's unique and doesn't affect gameplay is his name. For some reason, his full name is displayed on your party list. I'm not sure why this is the case, since we have Eula in the party, but her name isn't Eula Lawrence, it's just Eula. Anyway, let's start with his abilities. Since he is a support, unless you wail to C6, you will not be using his normal and charge attacks that much. However, you will be using his plunging attack a lot. Even though it's going to be the enhanced version of his elemental skill, it still scales with his plunging attack damage, so there's still a reason to level up his first talent. His elemental skill is going to be his most useful ability. You can press it or hold it, with the latter doing more damage and having a bigger AoE and longer cooldown. The AoE is not just how far he can do damage, it also affects the range he can group enemies together. Let me use this archer Hilichurl as an example. If I tap the skill at this distance, the archer isn't affected, but if I hold the skill, the vacuum effect is a little bigger, enough to catch the archer this time around. And here's footage to show the max distance of his skill. This spot is slightly too far away to pull in and damage the archer with both versions, but if I move just a step closer, I can catch him with the hold version. Since you do Anemo damage twice with the float and the plunge, you'll be swirling enemies twice as well, so the total damage of this elemental skill is higher than just the single hit you see on the talent page. His elemental skill also has 2 instances of the vacuum effect. The first is from the rising part of the attack. Notice the archer is moving in a little as I hold the skill. The second is from the plunge. You can see that this creates a little vortex that can also pull enemies in. Although knowing this doesn't really change his game plan. For his normal combo, you'll want to use his elemental skill, then immediately plunge down and use his burst. You want to land quickly and use his elemental burst before you absorb the energy particles. This will give you a head start to charge up for the next burst. As for the energy particles, tapping it will give you 3 and holding it will give you 4 if you hit an enemy. His elemental skill can also group up Klee's bombs and Xiangling's Guoba, similar to the other Anemo characters besides Venti. Another quality of his elemental skill is for traversal. You can treat it like Venti's skill to quickly gain some verticality. But in my opinion, it's actually better since you can use it in midair. Just push his skill while jumping or gliding and you will instantly gain some extra height. If you are starting to climb a wall, go ahead and hold his elemental skill to get a jump start. You can also jump then use the elemental skill, but holding it will give you more height. You can use his elemental skill mid-flight every 6 seconds, or less if you have 2 Anemo characters. This will help you maintain a high altitude while gliding long distance. This trick may be useful for, I don't know, exploring a brand new region or continent? Yeah, I think making traversal and exploration easier will definitely help out in the near future. And while I'm here, let's pump out another tip. Against the Ruin Hunter enemies, you can force them to use the bombardment attack if you change your elevation. This means Kazuha can also bait them to keep using this attack. You will still need an archer to hit his weak spot though. The other characters that can do this are Venti, Zhongli, Keqing, Geo Traveler, Albedo, and Xiao. Now let's move on to the Elemental Burst. He creates a large AoE about the same radius as holding his elemental skill, and this does damage to enemies 6 times. The first hit will do more damage since it uses the slashing modifier, while the other 5 pulses uses the dot modifier. Here's me using the same archer to show the attributes of the burst. Notice that the archer is too far away to get hit by Kazuha's actual burst. That's why he did not take Anemo damage. However, the archer is taking pyro damage. This is from the swirl reaction. The swirl effect on both the melee hilichurls are hitting the archer, even though the Anemo is not. Notice the archer takes 2 pyro hits here, one of them from each melee hilichurl. Now that one of the melee is gone, the archer only takes 1 hit from the last melee unit. This is a good example of the size of the swirl AoE. It's actually quite large. This also means the more enemies caught in his burst, the more damage they will do to each other. If you notice Venti's burst melting groups of enemies, this is the reason. Each enemy will create their own individual AoE hit. Also, his elemental burst snapshot, so if you have other units that can buff, like Bennett, then use their abilities before Kazuha to do even more damage. But that's only the case if you are using a damaged Kazuha instead of one that's focused on elemental mastery. That's because the damage from the swirl reaction is not affected by your crits or attack. If enemies inside your burst AoE are affected by different elements, there is a priority on which element gets infused by the burst. The Kazuha main Discord has performed many tests on this and found out that the priority order is Pyro, Hydro, Electro, then Cryo. This means, let's say, if Kazuha hits a Pyro slime and an Electro slime at the same time, his burst will be infused with Pyro instead of Electro. Now for the rest of his talents. His most damaging ability is his burst, so you will want to level that first. His elemental skill also does a good chunk of damage, but to maximize this, you'll need to level his plunge attack as well. His elemental skill combo does very good damage, but you'll need to level up 2 sets of talents, so that's why it's cheaper to focus on the elemental burst first. Both his Ascension passives are great as well. Ascension 1 increases his plunging damage by quite a bit. During combat, you should be using his E even when his burst is not ready to keep enemies grouped up anyway, and this Ascension 1 will increase the damage even more. His Ascension 4 is even better. This will increase your team's elemental damage and makes his elemental mastery builds really shine. The wording here is incorrect since he doesn't buff each character's corresponding element. In actuality, he will buff any element that gets swirled. This means any of the 4 major types, since you cannot swirl Anemo or Geo. Here's an example. My Kazuha has 61.6% Anemo damage and 0 on everything else. I'll use my elemental skill to swirl these slimes and we get a reaction from both Hydro and Cryo. If I check his stats now, we see his Hydro and Cryo bonus increase as well, but the Anemo stayed the same. If we look at Eula, we see the same thing. Even though she's a Cryo unit, her Hydro damage also went up. And same thing with Klee. Her Pyro damage did not increase, but the 2 elements that got swirled did go up. And lastly, his passive talent. This will reduce your stamina consumption, which is helpful both in combat and for exploration. This isn't a new passive since Kaya has this too, but it's better on Kazuha since you only need 1 more Anemo unit to activate the Team Elemental Resonance for faster move speed and even better stamina conservation. If you factor in all these abilities, Kazuha can do what most other Anemo characters can, but with more utility. Compared to Venti, Kazuha does a little less damage, but any character can still hit enemies in the center of his vacuum, unlike Venti's vacuum which makes most melee attacks miss. Compared to Sucrose, he does more damage and can group enemies a little tighter in the center, making it easier for your other team members to AoE them down. Sucrose is able to generate more energy with the Sacrificial Fragments and Constellation 1 though. And compared to Jean, Kazuha does better AoE damage and has crowd control, but Jean is able to heal and do unique fall damage combos. Now on to weapons. They will be ranked differently depending on how you want to build Kazuha. One of these roles is the burst support or swap DPS. They're both pretty much the same thing. For that role, you'll be focusing on increasing his personal damage and maximizing his DPS when he swaps into E and Q. Then there's the enabler or support build, which focuses on elemental mastery and swirls for damage. This support build will also buff your team's overall damage instead of focusing on his personal damage. For me, I prefer to build him as a support since he can still do a lot of damage from swirls thanks to the recent elemental mastery buff. The damage from swirl is not affected by Kazuha's attack and crit stats either. The damage is only affected by Kazuha's elemental mastery, his level, the enemy's level, and the enemy's resistance. This means you can give Kazuha all the unused Elemental Mastery artifacts you have saved up, since most other characters will prioritize other stats like crit and attack. I will start out with his support weapons since I like that build more. The best weapon for that build, to nobody's surprise, is the Freedom Sworn Sword that is currently in the weapon banner. This has been the case for a while, where a new character comes out with a new weapon designed specifically for them. The Skyward Blade is pretty decent since the energy recharge stat on the weapon allows you to focus on Elemental Mastery on the artifacts. However, it's not that much better than other 4-star weapons, despite it being a 5-star. The Iron Sting is going to be the best 4-star weapon for an Enabler Kazuha, which is surprising since this is also a craftable weapon. It has the second highest Elemental Mastery substat, and the passive boosts his overall damage as well. Sacrificial Sword is another great choice on Kazuha, since you can focus on less energy recharge for your artifacts. His elemental skill combo also does a good chunk of damage, so being able to do that twice in a row means more swirls and more continuous vacuum effects as well. The Dark Iron Sword is the best 3-star weapon, and it's free to get. To obtain this weapon, just talk to Chen the Sharp in Liyue, and ask him about the fishes. This weapon provides a lot of elemental mastery, and will give Kazuha a constant attack boost since he will always be swirling with his abilities. And after you get this weapon, make sure you lock it so you don't accidentally use it as fodder material. Currently, this is the only way to get this weapon, so it's one of a kind. The Alley Flash is okay, but not as useful for being how rare it is. This weapon barely gives any elemental mastery, so it's more focused on increasing Kazuha's personal damage. As for the other weapons not mentioned here, they are pretty average if you are focusing on increasing Kazuha's support capabilities. Now for the weapon list that focuses on Kazuha's burst or swap support damage. This time, we will want to focus on crit and attack to maximize his E and Q damage, while sacrificing some of the elemental damage buff from his Ascension 4 passive. This time, the Jade Cutter will be the strongest weapon, especially if you have good HP substats on your artifacts. The Freedom Sworn is good here too, due to its high base damage, and it still increases your attack percent. Now here's the weird one. The Aquila Phofonia is still good on him, even though you won't take advantage of the physical damage bonus. This is because this weapon has the highest attack in the game. The passive also helps since it increases your attack and can do AoE if you get hit. The best 4-star weapon will be the Lion's Roar, but that's only for specific teams that can put Pyro or Electro on your enemies. Without utilizing this passive, this weapon isn't that good. Another great sword for his burst support is the Alley Flash. This has the highest base attack among the 4-star weapons, and the passive is pretty good. You shouldn't be getting hit during the small time window that Kazuha is on the field anyway, especially when you are CCing the enemies. Sacrificial Sword is good at higher refinements when you can guarantee the passive to activate. You can also use the Festering Desire and Iron Sting, which are still decent for his burst support build since their passives are both beneficial. The Blackcliff has a great substat, but the passive isn't that useful, so it ends up being pretty average overall. And finally, I want to give an honorable mention to the Harbinger of Dawn. It doesn't have much base attack, but the substats and passive are always nice to have, and it's easier to get this to Refinement 5 compared to other weapons. As you can see from this weapon list, there are a lot of choices, and that's because Kazuha is a very flexible character. Even as you focus on building him as either an enabler or a DPS, he can still do a decent job on the other row at the same time. Now on to artifacts. The most universal artifact set will be 4-piece Venerer. This should be your go-to regardless of the build style. If you want more personal damage, you can also go with 2-piece Venerer and 2-piece Gladiator. There is a special set that uses 4-piece Blizzard Strayer, which will have him doing the most personal damage if you are running a freeze team. If you are not, then just ignore this set entirely. The stat priority for better personal damage will be attack percent on Sands, Anemo damage on Goblet, and crit on the helmet. You know, the normal stuff. If you want to focus on being an enabler, then go with 4-piece Venerer or 4-piece Noblesse if you don't already have another member with the 4-piece Noblesse set already on the team. The stat priority will be a little different. You'll want Elemental Mastery on Sands and Helmet, and for the Goblet, you should still run Anemo damage unless the rest of your team is extremely stacked. If that's the case, then go with triple Elemental Mastery artifacts. Now for the final part of this guide, his team comps. You can use Kazuha in any team that normally has Venti or Sucrose. There are two popular freeze teams that utilizes Kazuha's 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set. A support Kazuha will work better with Ganyu, Mona, and Diona. A main DPS Kazuha can work well with Chongyun, Xingqiu, and another Cryo user. The key member for this DPS team is Chongyun, and you might even want to replace the Anemo Goblet with a Cryo one. Instead of Cryo, you can also go for an Electric Charge team with Beidou, Xingqiu, and Fischl. Then there's the more common Vaporized teams with Bennett, Xingqiu, and either Diluc, Klee, or Yanfei as main DPS. As you can see, there's lots of different options with Kazuha since he is such a flexible unit. Any team that does mostly elemental damage will do just fine. So I think this is a good comprehensive overview of Kazuha. We talked about all his abilities and their unique features, and provided build and team ideas for both his burst support and enabler playstyle. Sorry this video took some time to come out, but like always, I want to get as much accurate info as I can before providing it to the public. If you enjoy these types of videos, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. It really does help. That's all for now, and as always, have fun out there, traveler.